Hi everyone, Amber here from Majestic. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited. I'm releasing my next pattern. It is for the Puff Quilt Pillowcase. So this is the one that we were making in the video. About a year ago, I filmed my original pillow, which was this one. So you might have already seen the tutorial on my YouTube channel for the Owlween one. I do give measurements and stuff, but now it is officially written up in a printed version. So again, this is the one that we are filming in the video. And you can see it has 5 rows of 5 puffs. On the back, it is an envelope style pillowcase. So what that means is that when you open it up, there's a pillow insert. And if you look inside, I'll use this as one of my originals. If you look inside, I have also put a lining so you don't see all the back of the puff squares. So I'm super excited about this one because I feel that puff quilts, when I was learning how to do them, could be so overwhelming. They had you cut such small pieces with so much cutting, tying. And so in this tutorial, I really recommend using charm packs, like charm squares, because they already come in 5-inch cuts. So then you are doing very little cutting just for the back linings of each of your puffs. And the great thing about this tutorial is you can take what you've learned for this puff quilt top and just expand it to make your own throw quilt or even larger. So I hope you find this tutorial helpful and less intimidating. Please let me know in the comments if you do. And as always, if you give me a thumbs up or if you could subscribe to my channel, it helps my channel grow and I appreciate it so much. So enjoy. Thanks. All right, so here I have the fabrics laid out that I'm going to be using today for the puff quilt pillow. You are going to need 25 squares for the top that are 5 inches on each side. For these, I chose to cut down fabrics out of some fat quarters. But one thing I love about this pattern and wrote it in this way is so that way you could use a charm pack. These are already 5-inch square and then save yourself a whole bunch of time cutting. And then you're going to need a lining fabric. So I have 25 squares cut out that are 4.5 inches on each side. So they're slightly smaller and you're going to see why when we make our pleats for the puff. And when you put all these together, it's going to measure 21 inches wide. So from that same lining fabric, I have cut out a 21-inch square. I do recommend if you are using the same fabric for the linings for the squares and the back of the puff quilt top, you cut this first, because if you only have 3/4 of a yard, you may not have enough fabric if you don't lay it out correctly. The other thing that works great is for the tutorial, I'm using the same backing just to make it look nice, but it's a great scrap buster. My quilt that I made a large throw size, I just used all random scraps of extra fabric that I had because it's not going to be seen. So if you have random scraps that you want to cut down for the backing, it's a great use. And then for the back of the puff quilt pillowcase for the envelope style, I am going to use this Shannon Minky. I love Minky for how soft it is. I know it can be very difficult to work with. So you can use your fabric of choice for the backing. It could be stretch or it could be non-stretch like a woven, and it will just determine how exactly you're sewing it and the way you're going to cut it, but I'll explain that all in the pattern. Now I have the tools and materials that I am going to be using. You have 2 options. I wanted to show you both. You could use the polyfill fiber fill, which is softer and more squishy, or you can use cotton stuffing, which is a bit firmer. So for my pillows, I prefer the fiber fill because your head's against it, so you want it to squish. But for my throw size and larger, I prefer the cotton because I like my blankets very heavy. So I guess the weight is also something to take into consideration. And then I'm going to have plenty of clips. I'm using a Tex 35 polyester bonded thread in lilac. It will match the colors that I'm using. You could use a lighter weight. Some people prefer to use cotton because this is going to be a pillow and it's going to be washed a lot. I prefer polyester. I have 2 sets of needles. I have Schmetz Universal that I'm going to be sewing with because when it's just the cotton, I might want a smaller needle. But then when I add on the minky, I definitely want it a little bit thicker. I have some curved needles here because I also have some extra embroidery floss. And this is what I use to tie, and the curved needles make it much easier to get through the fabric. So if you are going to tie the quilt, you definitely want a needle that has a large enough eye. You could also use yarn, or there's different types of and weights of embroidery thread. So whatever your preference is. I also have a seam ripper stiletto combo just in case, as well as a quilting ruler, or square acrylic ruler, and a rotary cutter. And you're going to want a cutting mat because I have not cut my backing, the minky, yet, because we need to measure our quilt first before we cut that down. And if there's anything else that I think that I'm going to be using, I will let you know as we go along through the quilt. All right, I have my stack of my puff quilt squares that are going to be the exterior and the stack for the lining. And like it shows in the instructions, the lining is cut shorter. So if you see, if we put it here, it's a 1/2 inch shorter. So we want our lining wrong side facing up because we're going to create our pockets. And now in the instructions, I show you how you can do this all at the machine. But my testers who are making a puff quilt for the first time found it helpful to clip and pin where the pleats are before sewing. So I'm going to show you both methods. So we want to line up our corner. So I'm starting in the top right hand corner. I am not using directional fabric, but if you are using directional, you want to make sure that your print is facing the correct way and you leave the top open. That the top of your print is towards the top, because when we leave this open, that's how we're going to stuff it. So if it's upside down, your print will be upside down. So it's easiest to clip the 4 corners first, and you'll see it creates like, a bubble in the center there. And that is because that's where our pleat is going to go. So I realize I'm using white fabric on a white table. So just bear with me. I'm going to hold it. I'll show you the back in a second. I'm just lining up all 4 corners first. I think it's easiest that way, and then to pleat them after. Okay, so from the front, I have all 4 corners clipped. In the back, you can see that the corners are matched up. So now from the front, I'm going to start on the right-hand side. I'm right-handed. I always just kind of start there. So I am just kind of pinching the fabric in the center. If I do it this way so you can see, I kind of want it to go in the middle. It doesn't need to be exact. You don't need to measure it. Just kind of estimate. And so I'm creating that little arch at the middle, and then I'm folding it. To me, it's going to be to the left. So if I'm holding it like this, it's towards me. If I'm looking straight on, it's towards the left. And then I'm going to break my clip. I'm going to clip that pleat in place. So in the back is completely flat. And then in the front, I now have that nice pleat clipped. And so now I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. It's just easier for me to turn it as I'm working. So again, my backing fabric is laying flat, and I'm arching it in the center and then folding it towards me. In the pattern, I call this like clockwise, because to me, we're working all the way around the clock, folding it towards ourselves. So now I'm going to do that third side. Again, making sure it's laying flat, the corners, and then folding that pleat towards me. And we are leaving our top open. Again, that's where we're going to stuff it. So if we are looking closely, we have all 4 corners clipped, and then our 3 pleats on the right, the bottom, and the left. And it really doesn't matter if you put the pleats to the left or the right, but you want to make sure whatever way that you decide to do it, you are doing that for all 25 squares, just so it's uniform. So now I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to baste stitch at 1/8 of an inch. You don't want to go wider than that because we don't want to see this stitching later. So I'm going to back stitch at the beginning here, and I'm going to sew down one side, get to the corner, pivot, sew down the next, pivot again, and come down that third side, back stitching at the end, and that is going to create our pocket. We're going to leave it open, and we're going to do all 25 of them the same exact way. And again, that's a base stitch at 1/8 an inch around the 3 sides. Okay, and I figured I'm going to sew one of these in not time lapse. That way you can see I'm using a 2.5 stitch length. I am back stitching at the beginning, and then I'm coming down my side here. This here where the pleat is, if you have your stiletto, it could be helpful kind of holding this all in place so you don't get your fingers too close. And I'm coming down to that bottom corner, lifting my presser foot as I'm rotating, sewing that next edge. And I'm just using a regular presser foot. You might find a walking foot works better for this. My presser foot is fine, so whatever you're more comfortable with. And again, I like the pleats. This is why I folded them towards me, because it just makes it easier to sew. They're kind of going with the fabric instead of trying to push that bulge and then accidentally having your presser foot push it the wrong direction. Okay, and then I'm going to trim that off. So you can see from the front, here is our first puff quilt square. We have the 3 sides sewed. You can see the pleats, so it's creating that 3D effect in the center. On the back, this is what it looks like. We have our 3 sides. And so we're going to repeat this for all 25 squares. All right, so now I'm going to show you how I make these squares without clipping. This is what works best for me. I find it quickest. So once you get in the habit, you might find this works well for you also. So again, I want my fabric, the lining, wrong side facing up, the quilt top exterior, puff quilt exterior, right side facing up, and I'm just lining up that first edge. So I'm putting that first corner underneath my presser foot, and I am back stitching and sewing about an inch down, just so I'm away from the corner. So now that I'm here, I am at the machine lining up this bottom corner. So the right hand side and the bottom is completely even, and I'm holding that in place with my right hand, and I am using my left hand to create that arch in the center, and I am pleating it and folding it towards me. So now with my left hand, I'm holding that pleat. With my right hand, I have the bottom corner held in place. If it's easier, you could clip them again, but just for speed, I leave them just like this and sew all the way to that first corner. And then when I get there, I lift my needle, I rotate, line up the edge, sew down about that inch length, line up this bottom corner again. It creates that nice little hill, And again, I'm just estimating where the center is. These puff up. It doesn't need to be perfect. They'll all line up pretty nicely. So once it's about in the middle, I'm folding it again towards me and continue sewing. And like I said, pleating it towards me just makes it so nicer under my presser foot. You could do it the opposite way, whatever works best for you. Now the last side, it's kind of already lined up a little bit. So now I am again lining up that last corner, creating that arch in the center. And if it gets a little funny, you can, stick a finger to help kind of pop it up like a little tent, and then fold it. And then back stitching at the end. And if you want to chain stitch them, you don't even need to cut this off. You can now just grab your next lining and exterior and continue it. But I want to show you, so I'm just going to clip it. And so you can see I made this one with the second method of doing it all right at the machine. I still have my pleats that are folded toward me. You can see this one's a little bit right of center. That's not a big deal. Like I said, when we start puffing these up, they are going to shift a little bit. So even if you mark perfect centers, they might not end up there. And again, if you look at the back, all three sides. So 2 different methods of sewing them. Use whatever one works best for you. And then you're going to continue and just sew all 25 in this method. Okay, so we have just finished sewing all 25 of our pockets. We're not stuffing them yet. We are going to figure out the layout that we want. So I used 5 different fat quarters. So I have 5 different fabrics, and I'm just laying them out real quick because I want to put a diagonal pattern, but you can arrange these in whatever order that you feels best. I've done some where I've had 25 different fabrics. I've had some like this where I rotate 5. It's a great, comes together. It looks really nice if it's scrappy. And a few of the people that tested did a really cool pattern with a diagonal through it. So I think for me, that is what I want to try. So I'm going to lay out, you're going to have 5 rows of 5. So I'm going to lay out my greens first, and then you'll see the other diagonals are going to rotate. So I think I'm going to put the white in the bottom, and then I'm going to do purple, okay, so as you can see, I have laid them out in a diagonal pattern. All the openings are towards the top. So that's really important. If you are using directional fabric, you want to make sure that they are opening towards the top because of how we are sewing them together. It is very important. So now what I do is I'm going to label them into rows, starting at the bottom. So the bottom one is my 5th row, and I'm going to place them on top of each other starting from the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to continue that for each row. And it's super easy to flip them around. I've definitely accidentally put the wrong ones in order before. And I'm leaving them in a row, even though it's harder for me to reach right now, just so that way I do not accidentally switch any of these around. Okay. Because now I am going to take some sticky notes and I am going to label them. So I'm going to start at the bottom, row 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And this way they stay organized. And so if you were making more, you didn't want to do a puff quilt pillow, if you wanted to turn this into a quilt, I made my throw quilt using the same exact method. But instead of 5 rows, I think it was like 15 or 16. And instead of 5 across, I believe it was 14 maybe. So it was quite large. All right, so once you have these all stacked and lined up, we're going to start attaching each row across. All right, so now that we have all our rows in stacks, I'm going to start with row 5. You can actually work in any order for this part. I just prefer to start at the bottom and work my way up. So you can lay them back out again, or what I like to do is just put my sticky note to the side because I still need to remember that this is going to be row 5. And I start at the top, and I know my first one is going to be my first block. And I know my second one is the second. So you're going to put them right sides together with the openings at the top. And I am going to clip these into place. And I'm doing that, one, obviously, so it just holds it in place for me. But 2, when I have done this before, it's very easy to grab your block and then put it to the left or confuse yourself. So I am clipping it here so I know to sew on this side. So I'm going to take it to the machine and sew at a full 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the top and the bottom. And we're using the full 1/4 inch because we basted these together or sewed these together at a 1/8 inch seam. So that 1/4 inch is going to hide our old stitching. So after I sew this first one, I'm going to open it back up, attach my third, same thing, open it, 4th, and then the 5th. And this way I have them in the order that I want to go. So I'm going to bring them to the machine, and I'm going to start with my first 2 and work my way across the row. Okay, so I have my row 5 sewed together. This is what it looks like on the back side. You can see if I come close, the double row of stitching, the basting stitches are towards the right, and my regular stitch is further to the left. So when we open them, you do not see any stitches. So you might want to check just to make sure, because if you see stitches, they're going to show in your final quilt. So we're not stuffing or doing anything with this row yet. What I do is I put my little sticky note back on it, and then I start with the next row. So I'm going to do the same exact process with row 4, putting the puffs right side together, working from left to right. And you are going to do these for all 5 rows. And like I said, it doesn't matter the order that you sew the rows in for this part, but it will matter how we stuff them. All right, so I'm going to do the rest of this part off camera because it's the same exact process for all the next steps until we have our 5 rows sewed together. Okay, so now I have all 5 rows sewed together. I have them laid out in order just so I can check the pattern and you can see that it's correct how I want it. The diagonals are all there. So that's important that you double check that you have it laid out how you would like it. So now this is where it is important that we start with row 5. So some other puff quilt tutorials have you stuff them all individually and try to sew them together. And to me, that's so difficult because you have 2 puffs with both with stuffing in it. So this way we're only going to have 1 at a time with stuffing. So we're going to start with row 5, the bottom. And I have fiberfill or this cotton stuffing. I prefer this one when I am doing a throw quilt and I want the weight of it. For pillows, I prefer fiberfill. So this is a huge bag. I've made a ton of puff quilt pillows. I even use it in my classroom as like fake snow. So a little bit goes a long way. And now when it comes to stuffing the puffs, you can do it based on preference. I tend to take like a size that kind of fits up on my palm, and you're going to stuff them in. And I stuff it all the way to the bottom because we're going to have to sew the top and you don't want the stuffing in the way. So once you've put a little bit in, you can determine, do you like it a little bit, or do you need a little bit more? Now, if this is your first puff quilt, I recommend putting less. Less is definitely more. If you've made a couple and you're used to sewing with thicker items, you can add a little bit more in. And that's what I'm going to do because I prefer my puffs to be very stuffed. So it is just a personal preference. And what I tend to do is I stuff all 5 across. And then I kind of just look at them and see if they look even. If I see one that's a little bit kind of less, I might add some more to it. Like I think that second one. So I'm just going to put a little bit in each one for now. All right, so once they're all stuffed, they actually look pretty even. Even this second one, maybe I'll put a little bit more in the second one. I'm also feeling them too to see if they like squish down the same. And you can see that now that I've stilled them, it's starting to curl. So the more stuffing you put in, the more your puff quilt is going to kind of like squish up. Just as something to keep in mind, because that's why when we cut the background, we don't already have our backing cut, because it's going to depend on our final measurements. So now here, I used to just take my 4th row, put them right sides together and form the pleats at the machine. But during testing, it was told to me that it's a little bit easier if people basted this ahead of time. So you could form your pleat as you go, like this, or ahead of time, I should say, not as you go. You could pleat them ahead of time, or the second method that I showed at the machine where you start sewing and fold them right there at the machine. You can do that too. I'm just going to do them right here for right now. You might have to kind of like squish them down in order to find the little extra fabric. It can be a little bit tricky. I find that by pulling them apart, the backside, the backing becomes taut, the lining, and then that front kind of overlaps. And again, I'm not measuring. I'm just, as long as they're mostly in the center, you're fine. They're going to match up. What I am making sure is that they're all facing the same direction. So all my pleats are going to the right. That part is important if you want everything to be uniform. So like when we were talking about before, it was like kind of going around clockwise around the square. We're just continuing that same pattern by folding it to the right. Okay, so now that I have them all clipped, I am going to take this to the machine and just run a basting stitch along the top at 1/8 an inch, just like we did when we formed the pockets. The other thing I'm going to be mindful of is I'm making sure all my seam allowances are going to go the same way. For this one, I'm going to make sure that they're all pointing towards the right, just because when I sew, my presser foot will push them that way. It will just be easiest. If you want to take an iron and give them a press so they face one direction, you can do that. It might make it easier. So again, I'm going to take it to the machine and do my 1/8 basting stitch along the top of this row 5. Okay, so I just ran my basting stitch across the top. All my seams are pushed to the right. and I still have all my pleats. Everything looks good. And the reason that we are starting from row 5 is because now we can add row 4 to it without stuffing this first. If you started at the top, you would have to stuff the first row and the second row. So this way, working from the bottom allows you to do it without having 2 rows of stuffing at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these right side together. So row 4 is on top, row 5 is on the bottom. So I'm going to put them right sides together with the openings toward the bottom. So the basted edges are together, and we are going to line up the seams. So on row 5, the bottom row, they're all to the right. So row 4, that is on top, I'm putting them to the left. And I'm just aligning and clipping my seams first. And I'm going to clip, I do the first seam and then I come back and clip this edge over here. And it still might be a little bit tricky because the bottom row 5 is filled with stuffing already, but it's way less tricky than if both of these were filled. And as long as your seam allowances are accurate or mostly accurate, they should be lining up and nesting perfectly your seams. So you should have, if you open this up, you should have your row 5 with your stuffing, your row 4 right sides together with the opening towards the bottom. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to take this to the machine and we are going to sew at our full 1/4 inch along the top, which is going to sew these 2 rows together, and it's going to seal the top of row 5. So the stuffing is going to be, or we've already basted it. Sorry, I'm so used to doing it without closing it. So it's going to just attach them together, and you want to make sure you're doing the full 1/4 inch. And you can see here that the backside, because it's puffed, is going down a little bit. You may want to clip them in the middle to ensure that you catch it. So it may be easier, again, if you are just learning how to do a puff quilt. I usually adjust for that at the machine. Okay, so I'm going to take it to the machine and sew my regular stitch at a 1/4 inch all the way across. All right, so I have just sewed my full 1/4 inch along the top, made sure that my seams stayed nested. So again, if it's helpful to press your seams, you can do that. When you open it up, this is what it should look like. You should have your bottom row stuffed, your 4th row not stuffed, and you want to just double check that you don't have any of those basting seams showing. And you'll notice that the pleats are starting to line up. So even though they are not perfectly measured, the way that the puffs fill out, they end up being very close to each other. So this made it easier to sew instead of having 2 rows completely stuffed. So now we're going to repeat the same step we did for row 5. We're going to do the same thing for row 4. We're going to add all our stuffing in and then do the basting stitch across the top and then sew our row 3 onto it. So I'm going to do this next part on time lapse just to give you an idea of what it looks like. I just stuffed row 4 and have clipped the pleats. So what I want to tell you before you baste it, we remember that we already nested our seams. So our row 4 seams are pointing to the left. So this top row, they're all pointing to the left because that's how we did it down here. So when I baste this close, I want to make sure that those seams on the top are still pointing to the left. Otherwise, we're going to have a twisted seam back here. So that is something to be mindful as you're basting each row and sewing them together, that your seams are facing the correct direction and they're alternating between each row. So again, the 5 are to the right, the 4th row is to the left. So now I have just basted my row 4. And you can see again that this is starting to squish up. So as I'm sewing, whether it's the basting stitch or the 1/4 inch, something that I find that's helpful, once this is under my presser foot, and say I've sewed down about 1 inch with the needle down, I hold where the pleats are and kind of just tug a little bit, and it straightens out this seam. So as this is running underneath the presser foot, I'm just putting just a slight pull towards me to help straighten out these fabrics, because you can see that I have mine so puffy that they're starting to form like almost like little C's. So that's another suggestion that you can use if you're having trouble sewing them. Also, make sure you're stuffing as far down to the bottom as possible, so make it a little bit easier as well. Okay, so now that we have row 5, we have row 4. And now we're going to repeat the same process for row 3. Again, putting it right sides together, folding it down towards you so the openings are facing you. And we are clipping the seams. So row 4 went to the left. So now my top row, row 5, is going to the right. Again, if you press them already, it might be a little bit easier. I do as little pressing as I can. All right, so I'm going to actually finish clipping and basting and stuffing the rest of the rows off camera because they follow the same exact method. And once we get to row 1, we're just going to baste the top, and I'll come back to show you what to do next. All right, so I have just finished stuffing the rest of the rows and all the way up to the first row and basting it closed. Now, this is what it looks like on the back. If you don't want to do this next step, you could leave it just like this. It's going to be inside of your pillow and you're not going to see it. So I personally, a lot of the woven fabrics are fraying. So I like to cover this, which is why I have a lining and I do ties between each square. The other thing is like, this is only, 5 rows by 5. You really don't have to tie it if you don't want to, but I just prefer the look of it. Makes it look more like a quilt. And when I get to start explaining, you could do every other, but this is kind of like a preference thing. So as I said before, when we stuff them, they tend to squish up. So if we were going by regular seam allowance, or if this was unstretched, if we stretch it out, it would measure 21 inches across. But if I measure it here, it's about 18 and a half. And also the same exact way going up is still about 18 and a half. And that's because my measurements, my stuffing that I put in is quite poofy. Yours might be a little bit wider or shorter depending on your stuffing. But what wouldn't change is that when it's fully stretched, it should still measure 21 inches. So now, this is where we need our lining, which I use the same lining like I did for the back. If I was just making this not for the video, I would use scraps, and these might be different colors, and the same for this, it might not match. But I made it look uniform and wanted it to look kind of nice for the video. So this square that I cut out is 21 by 21. So that way when my puff quilt pillowcase top is completely stretched out, it would measure exactly across. And so now I have it with the wrong side facing up because we are going to place our puff quilt pillowcase on top of it. So it's a little hard to see again because I have the white table and the white lining. I didn't really think about that when I cut it. So I want to basically center my quilt. If you were making a larger throw size or a puff quilt pillowcase, this is how, not a puff quilt pillowcase, sorry. If you were making a throw size or larger, this is exactly how I made my throw size. Except for doing this lining, I made this minky. And you could put a row of batting between it, and then you would tie it all together, and then I folded my edges over to bind it. So you could take the same exact method, just keep expanding it to make a quilt. But this is going to be the inside of our pillowcase. So that way when we flip it over, we don't see all those squares inside. And I'm going to have a solid minky back later on. So this is where the tying comes into play. So I have a couple different threads. They are embroidery thread, looks like this, but I had already opened and used some. I also have curved needles. I think I have some linked in my Amazon that I've used before. One of them broke, like the tip started to get dull, so I bought some new ones. And I prefer to do use two at a time. And I'm going to use the two larger because it just makes it easier. Now, the other thing that you can do, if you want, you can stretch this out and clip the lining all the way around. But what that means is the backside is going to get really kind of like bunched up and loose because with the puffs, it squishes up. So my preferred method to do this is to just basically center it around the lining because we're going to tie between the puffs and then we're going to base stitch around. And when you're base stitching around, this could get stretched out, but I try not to stretch it. So let's start with the tying. I am going to cut these a little bit shorter. You could use yarn, embroidery thread. Some of the people who tested this, instead of tying, they just used their sewing machine and tacked between each squares. I don't like that method for myself because I feel like it gets very thick for my machine. If you are using an industrial machine or, a heavy duty, I mean, my machine could probably go through it. It is pretty heavy duty, but it's just so thick because it's where all those corners are coming together. The other thing is each of these embroidery threads have 6 strands. You can use all 6. You could pull them apart. I like to use 3. I find that if I'm using 6, that they sometimes want to come untied, or I have to like triple or quadruple knot them, or use like what's called a surgeon's knot. That wasn't coming apart easy, so I just trimmed it. I'm going to do the same thing over here, just so I can get my 3 and 3. I used to use all 6, and then I found that my preference is for less. See, that one came apart nicely. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And why I like to use 2 needles is I like to make an X between each of my blocks. You could not tie this. You could only do like one side, but I prefer... Sorry, just drop that on the floor. I prefer to have an X just so it looks uniform. But there's really no like wrong way to do this. And like I said, it's very important if you're making a larger quilt. For the pillowcase, not so much. So I am doing this on a table. You can see my table is like marked. It has like a hole in it. So I don't mind that when I'm pushing this needle through, it's going to hit the table. But if you are using a surface underneath that you don't want scuffed, I recommend putting like a cutting mat or something. So what I do is I start in one corner and I just push the needle all the way down until I can feel it pop through. And depending on the side, some are a little bit thicker than the other. So you can see I'm going through a lot of layers here. Or you can see how I'm struggling. You might want a thimble too to help push this through. And sometimes I have to move the needle. If it's too thick, like I think I'm going through actually too many right there. So I'm just going to move it a little bit further out. Yeah, it's partly coming through. So this is like my least favorite part. And I like going, so now I can feel it against the table and I can just, with the curved needle, pop it up on the other side. And like I said, once, depending which way your seams are folded, it makes it a little bit more difficult or harder on one side. This is the first time I'm using these needles. Saw me open the pack. The other ones that I had were upholstery needles that I have linked on Amazon, and those seem to go through a little bit better. This one is giving me some trouble. I might have to, even though I only have one of them left, use them instead, because these are not really wanting to go through. So you can see that I have the one, and I don't tie it yet. So what I do next is I come through on that other side. So now I have them through on each side. And what I do is I just pull them so I have enough left that I could tie them, trim off the edges, and then I tie 2 and 2. And I definitely recommend at least triple knotting. Like, it's nice to go one way and then another, so the threads are going different ways. I'm going to do it 3 times just to be sure. And I don't tie them like too tight. There's a little bit of movement underneath here. Just to, that way the fabrics can move and not rub. And then I trim them down. So there's about, I'd say like 1/4 of an inch left. So if you're looking, I'm going to bring it close to the camera so you can see. Here's the tie, comes from each side. And on the back side, you can see the X. So I, like I said, prefer to do this between every single square, which can take a long time. Like I said, it's my least favorite part. So you could go one side to the other, not do an X. You could skip between squares, whatever works best for you. You could even feel and kind of tack them down. Maybe instead of going directly through the center on your machine, just a little bit below. And really, like I said, this is just to, when you look at the inside of the pillowcase, you don't see all the squares. So it's really for looks for this side. So I'm going to continue doing that off camera because it will take some time to be able to do it. And I've already showed you the first, and a lot is left up to preference. All right, I want to show you real quick before I keep going. I pulled out the upholstery needles that I was using before. You can see the size difference. They're much larger. So I recommend these, and I'm going to try to show you to see if it goes a little bit smoother with them, because those small ones were a lot more difficult than I expected. So with these, I can get such a good grip with my hand that it went right through, and I can just easily pop up the other side. So yeah, in this case, I definitely think the larger needle is much better. So if you are struggling trying to get this through, look for a larger upholstery needle. That's what these were. All right, I have just finished tying between every single square. Like I said, it's my least favorite part, but I love the end look. I just think it makes it look really uniform and finished. So that's why I choose to do it between every single square. You'll notice I have extra fabric on the side still. That's because I did not stretch this as I was making the X's. If you look on the back, you can see that in the intersections, there's an X. Ideally, both threads have come through to the back side, but you can see right here, I missed, and only one of them has come through. So the other thing is that when we look inside our puff quilt pillowcase, this is what you're going to see. And I want mine as least like rippled as possible. If I were to stretch this puff quilt pillowcase to the end and just sew around the end, I'd have ripples all like this. And that's okay because you're not going to see it. But ideally, I try to keep this as flat as possible. So our next step is I'm going to take this to the machine, and I don't even bother clipping. I'm just going to start on the side, and I'm going to baste stitch the puff quilt pillow top to this lining edge. And I'm not going to stretch it. As you can see, if I were to stretch this, this would come out much further. What I'm going to do is try to just baste it down, and where the puffs are kind of like making that C shape, I'm just going to push the puff down, and it will kind of, you can see it's kind of straightened out the line. So I am going to push the puffs as I'm sewing, and I'm going to do my best not to pull and stretch them. And at the end, we'll trim off the edge, like the extras. If you stretch it, it's okay, as long as you're catching the lining all the way around. That's like the big thing that you want to make sure that you're doing, that all four sides are going to be sewed to the lining. So again, I'm going to take it to the machine. I'm going to base stitch at 1/8 an inch all the way around, catching the lining to the puff quilt top and making sure that it's attached nicely.
Till I get up. Time is
So now I've just basted all the way around the lining. You'll see on some sides it's overhanging. This side's a little bit wider than this side here. And this is what the back looks like, which is like fairly flat. There's a little bit of like some extra fabric, but it's to be expected because it's puffs and it's not perfectly flat. So from the front side, what I'm doing now is I'm just going to trim off all the excess lining. So I'm just following along, trying not to trim into my squares. So I don't want to cut into any of the needed like seam allowance. So you might have gone all the way to the edge. That's fine. As long as you have caught the lining around all four sides, that's what's most important. So now that means that our back of our puffs are completely covered. Like I said before, this method, if you did this method to make a larger quilt, instead of trimming this off, you could fold it over, use it as binding, or you could trim it and bind it a more traditional way. But this lining piece would just be your backing in order to expand the concept of the puff quilt pillowcase into a traditional quilt. So I'm going to trim off the rest of the other two sides and then come back and show you what is next. Alright, so I have just trimmed all around all four sides. So now we're going to measure our puff quilt again. It shouldn't have moved too much. It might have when you were sewing the backing. I'm hoping mine still stays about 18.5. And if I don't want to squish it down, because if I do this, then it comes closer to 19. And when I cut my backing fabric, if I cut it too large, it's going to have like this gap in it. So I'm just setting my ruler down gently on top and kind of like looking through to get a close enough estimate, which is, it's about 18.5, maybe 18.75. But I'd rather go with the smaller number. And you can check the top because you might have it varying a little bit. But again, yeah, so my bottom here is about 18.75. The top is closer to 18.5. So I'm going to remember that. And then I want to check going vertical as well. And it looks about 18.5. So yours might be a little bit longer if you used less stuffing. And that's okay. What you need to remember, or you want to write down, is what your measurements are. And the most important measurement to keep exact is the width, because we're going to create an envelope style. So the height is going to be different because when we flip this over, we're going to have a smaller piece on the bottom of backing and a larger piece that overlaps it. So our height is not going to be cut to 18.5, unless of course you wanted to like add a pillow in somehow and then flip it and make it so you can't take off the pillowcase. But in this case, we're making it envelope style. So we don't want our fabrics wider than our pillow. So for me, I am using 18.5. You're going to use whatever your width is. And I'm going to grab my backing fabric and then I'm going to show you how I cut it and tell you the height measurements that I use and how you can adapt it for your own measurements. So now I have my puff quilt pillowcase top and Shannon Minky. This is a print that kind of has fibers going two different directions. So you want to make sure that your Minky or whatever you're choosing is facing the correct direction. The other thing to think about is if you're using a stretch fabric. So Minky has a stretch, and you want that stretch going left to right. It doesn't have it going along the grain vertically. So if you are using a fabric that has a stretch, make sure the stretch is going horizontally. The other thing is if you're using a fabric without a stretch, then you're going to probably have to ease the pillowcase in because this pillow might stretch a little bit as we're sewing. So if you are sewing to the Minky, it will kind of go along with it. But if you are using like a woven, this might stretch and your backing isn't. So you want to make sure that you're going to use a lot of clips, but I'll explain that later on. We're going to cut 2 pieces out of our backing to create an envelope style. I am cutting one 18.5 inches wide because you want it as wide as your top. So whatever your width is, that's your width. And because mine is also 18.5 inches tall, I'm cutting one piece 15 inches tall and a second piece 12 inches tall. And why you want to be mindful of the way the fabric is going, we are putting the 15-inch one on the top and the 11 or 12-inch one on the bottom. That way, when they overlap, there's a few inches, and it doesn't keep your pillow from busting out the back. So I'm going to cut mine off camera because Minky gets really messy and there's not a lot of space here to cut. If your pillowcase is smaller than 18.5, say it comes out only 18 inches, you want to cut your width to that 18, and then you can take a 1/2 inch off one of those shorter measurements. So like I'm doing 18.5 by 15 and 18.5 by 12. So however much your puff quilt pillow top is wider or taller, you can add or subtract those differences. And that's why I don't have you cut this piece ahead of time, because depending on how puffy the quilt is, your measurements are going to be slightly varied. I think most of my testers had around 18.5. Some had 19, some had 18. So it really just depends. And some had where it kind of tapered a little bit and one side, like maybe the top or the bottom was a little bit less wide. You can cut it to either the smaller measurement or the larger, and you're just going to have to kind of taper it and adjust it. But with the actual pillow insert inside, a lot of that space gets eaten up. So it's important to have the measurements close, but if they're off by like, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, it really shouldn't mess it up too much when you're putting it together. All right, so I'm going to cut those 2 pieces off and come back once I have them. All right, so I have cut my 2 pieces, 18.5 width. The top one is 15 inches tall. The bottom one is 12 inches tall. And what we're going to do is this is going to create our envelopes. What I mean by that is this is going to get overlapped, but I do not want this raw edge showing. So when I'm using Minky, this is not going to fray. So I leave it raw edged. If you are using like a cotton woven or something that is going to fray, I would fold it under twice. And so I'm going to turn this to the back. Also, you want to make sure your fabric is going the correct way. which mine is like if you're using fibers that you can tell. So I'm going to fold this over an inch to the back. And I do that by just kind of like laying my ruler here and folding it. You could draw a 1-inch mark and then fold it. And with Minky, it's very slippery. So that's why I'm folding it over 1 inch. Now, if you are using woven, I recommend folding it down a 1/2 inch and then a second time another 1/2 inch, which will encase that raw edge. If you're doing Minky, I just recommend this 1 inch fold over. You could fold it twice. If you're going to do that, definitely fold it only maybe a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch, because you don't want to lose too much in the height. If you fold it under and you are folding it under by like 2 inches, your envelope might not stay enough. Okay, so now on the bottom, this is the bottom of our envelope style. So I folded under the top because that's the part that is going to be seen. These 3 sides are going to get sewed to the edges of our pillow. So the same thing for this top piece. I'm going to move this one to the side for right now. We want to fold our bottom under. So again, I am just going to flip that. I like putting my ruler down. Like I said, you could draw your line, whatever is easiest for you. I'm just making sure that this comes all the way. And then I just kind of slide out my ruler and clip it into place. And this way we have 2 hemmed edges, and our pocket, envelope style pocket will look very clean. So again, if I flip this to the front, this is going to be the top of our backing. This is going to be the bottom. And by the time we're done sewing this, it's going to overlap. And this is what I mean. This is what it's going to look like. So this way you have a hemmed edge here. When you open it up to put your pillow in, you're going to have a hemmed edge in the bottom. So since I folded mine under 1 inch and I'm sewing with Minky, which is slippery, I'm going to hem across at a 1/2 inch. But if you are using fabric where you folded it under twice, you probably only want to hem it at maybe like a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to take it to the machine and I am going to top stitch across both of these at a 1/2 inch. All right, so I have just hemmed these at about a 1/2 inch. Because it is the Minky, it really blends in. From the back side, it looks like this on mine. Yours might not be raw edge. You might have double folded it, and that is okay. So now we're on the final steps of our puff quilt. I'm going to push these to the side for just a minute and grab my puff quilt pillow top. So now I want my puff quilt pillow top facing right sides up. And I want to grab my top piece that has the hem on the bottom, and I want to put it right side facing down, lining up the top. And so I'm going to turn it around. So lining up the top edge and the side edges, because we're going to flip this right side out, and I want the top one, that's going to be the longer one, to show. So we're putting that first, and I'm not clipping mine yet. You can clip this in place if you'd like to, but I'm not going to do it quite yet for mine. And then now I'm taking my second piece and I am putting it again right side facing down, lining up the bottom edge and the sides. I got like a little bird's nest here. I just noticed I'm gonna have to trim off. So if I come from the side here, you can see that there's quite a few inches. Let's see. There's about 4.5 inches of overlap. And that's good because when we put our pillow in, this is going to puff out. So it gives it a little bit of wiggle room where our pillow is not showing. If you have a puffy pillow, you can even add snaps to this later on. if it opens up too much, but it should be okay. So now I'm going to start flipping this all the way around, and I'm going to clip where that overlap is first. And I'm just lining up the edges of my minky backing with the edges of the puff quilt pillow top. And if you can feel the stuffing in the seam allowance, you might want to try to push some of the stuffing more towards the center. And it should line up fairly well. Where there's some wiggle room is that you might have used, like, the minky is stretchy along the horizontal, and the puff quilt pillow is also stretchy. So as you're clipping all this, you want to try not to stretch them. And I'm going to do this side next. So that way that these are lined up fairly equally. And I'm going to keep clipping along this side here and then along the top of the bottom, and I'll come back to show you the next step. Okay, so I have just finished clipping all the way around. I was very mindful not to stretch, that it just, you can kind of see here where there's like a little, I don't want to call it a ripple, but there's some extra fabric. So I'm just clipping it like straight on. Because if I stretch it, it's going to make it so the puff quilt pillow top is wider, and then our pillow might not sit in as nicely because it's like stretched out. So now I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. I like using a 1/2 inch because I want to ensure that even if this is not as stretched out or stretched out, that I'm catching everything. And also because I'm using a minky backing, and with the fur, it can be kind of hard to make sure you're catching it. If you're not using minky, you could probably do a lesser seam allowance, like a 3/8. But for this, I prefer the 1/2 inch. I also am going to sew it with the minky side down on my machine. So that way the woven side is facing up, because I'm using a regular presser foot. I find that that works best. My minky doesn't stretch out that way. If you have a walking foot, it would probably be really helpful for this step. And I'm going to do my best to just sew it without stretching it as I go. If it stretches a little bit, it should still be fine, especially when you put a pillow in. So don't worry about it too much, but do your best to try not to stretch it. Okay, so again, you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the edge.
Till I get up, time is barely on our side.
All right, so I've just finished sewing all the way around. If you want to trim your seam allowance, you can. Also, if you do, I'm going to leave this as a raw edge because it's going to be inside of the pillowcase. If you want to put binding over this, you could absolutely bind it. That way, none of this is showing. For that part, I don't get too picky because, like I said, it's going to be inside of the pillowcase. So now we're going to just reach in and turn it right sides facing out. And you want to make sure that you poke out the corners here. And I'm just using my hand. But if you have like a turning tool, usually I use a chopstick, but it's not right next to me. But these corners are pretty wide, so my hand works just fine. All right, so from the front, here's our puff quilt pillow top. And then from the back, you can see that the minky, it lines up pretty nice, or your backing should line up nice. And if you open it, there's quite a bit of overlap. So our pillow's going to sit nice. And then because we put that lining in, if you happen to look inside, we don't see the, like the backs of our puffs. It's kind of like a nice finish. So I'm going to go and grab a pillow so I can show you what it looks like inside. Okay, so I have this pillow here. It's an insert from IKEA. It's a 20 by 20, so it's a little bit bigger. It might puff out, but I just want to show you. So now we can insert our pillow in, and with all this extra overlap, even though that this pillow is a 20 by 20 and slightly bigger than that 18.5 inches width, we have enough overlap that it's not spilling out on the inside. And then, so here we go from the front, and we're all done. All right, so we have just finished our puff quilt pillowcase. I really hope you found the tutorial helpful. Please let me know in the comments if you do, or give a thumbs up. This is my favorite way to do a puff quilt. I have made a throw that I use all the time, especially in winter. It like lives on my couch. I really think it's helpful to have the envelope style so you could take it off and clean. And as I said before, my favorite part of using the charm pack to make it a little bit easier and less cutting. So again, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you next time. Bye.